Inside the opulent five-star hotel, Claire followed closely behind Alexander, stepping into the gleaming elevator. As always, she positioned herself discreetly behind him. She stole a glance at the tall, imposing figure before her and bit her lip. She'd been impulsive, drawn in by the deceptive familiarity of his voice. A week ago, a late-night call from a seemingly intoxicated Alexander had summoned her to settle his bar tab. That night, she'd lost herself to him, his voice an uncanny echo of her missing boyfriend. The impulsive act had left her filled with fear and uncertainty. She'd considered running, but instead, she'd confronted Alexander, offering her resignation. He'd refused. "Something on your mind?" He turned, his voice surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to his usual professional demeanor. His dark eyes held hers. Claire dropped her gaze, shaking her head. The elevator doors opened, and Alexander stepped out. Claire hesitated, her gaze fixed on his retreating back. An affair with such a powerful and successful man felt like a dangerous temptation. She was afraid of falling too deep, aware that a man like him wouldn't belong to just one woman. "Coming?" Alexander paused, turning back to her. "Yes, sir," she mumbled, hurrying after him. The waiter led them to a private dining room. The client hadn't arrived yet. Claire sat nervously on a plush sofa while Alexander made a call by the window. Minutes ticked by. Claire glanced at him. His voice, soft and intimate, dripped with affection. A pang of jealousy shot through her. Who was he talking to? A lover? His wife? The memory of their one night together stirred unexpected emotions. She had a boyfriend, a loving boyfriend. Or she did, until he disappeared at sea a year ago, along with his best friend. She was supposed to love him, but now, she could barely recall his face. Alexander had taken over as CEO of the family business a month ago. Rumor had it he was the long-lost eldest son, finally returned. And she, Claire, was just a secretary. Plucked from obscurity when Alexander noticed her during a visit to the branch office. He'd made her his personal secretary, a promotion that sparked envy among her colleagues. Suddenly, Alexander turned, their gazes locking. Instinct told her to look away, but a strange defiance held her captive. She met his gaze with a small, almost defiant smile, surprised by her own boldness. A flicker of amusement and admiration crossed Alexander's face. He studied her for a moment. Claire, jolted back to reality, realized the impropriety of staring at her boss. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Harrison hasn't arrived yet. Should I call his office?" "No. Sir? He's not coming." Alexander hung up and sat down, his gaze softening. "Aren't you hungry?" Claire hesitated. He was her boss, she was his employee. This was a business dinner. Ignoring her hesitation, he rang the service bell. A waiter appeared. "May I take your order, sir?" Alexander nodded, picking up the menu. This, and this. Claire realized he was ordering all her favorite dishes. It felt as though they'd known each other for years. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. When the waiter left, she sat across from him. "Nervous about dining with me?" he asked, amusement in his voice. "You're my boss," she murmured. "Oh." He took a sip of tea, his eyes twinkling. "How about I become your husband?" "What?" Claire stared at him, dumbfounded. "You become my wife, I become your husband. Then you won't be nervous dining with me." He smiled. "Mr. Sterling, you're joking. I have a boyfriend." She looked down. "A boyfriend?" He feigned surprise. "Yes." Alexander's fingers tapped lightly on the table. "Does your boyfriend know you slept with me?" Claire jumped up, her heart pounding. "Mr. Sterling, that was a mistake. Please don't bring it up." "A mistake? I seem to recall you being quite enthusiastic." Claire flushed, tears stinging her eyes. Mr. Sterling, what do you want? I already told you. He smiled. Claire stood frozen. Did he really want her to be his wife? Are you willing to give up your other women for me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He frowned, then chuckled. Other women? If you marry me, I'll gladly give them up. You're far more important than other women. His gaze swept over her, a flicker of heat in his eyes. Claire felt like an object under his scrutiny, the feeling unsettling. His playful demeanor vanished, replaced by seriousness. Don't worry. As my wife, you'll have your freedom. Do what you want, be who you want. I won't interfere. Except, he added with a smirk, you'll be living with me. Claire stood rooted to the spot, her mind in turmoil. His charisma was intoxicating, yet guilt gnawed at her. Guilt for the boyfriend lost at sea, for the betrayal she was contemplating. The door opened, and the waiter began serving their meal. When they were alone again, Alexander gestured to her chair. Sit down and eat. I'm not going to bite. He picked up his chopsticks and placed a piece of beef, her favorite, in her bowl. The aroma made her stomach growl. She sat down and began to eat. Alexander watched her, a small smile playing on his lips. An hour later, they were in his car. Claire was reviewing his schedule when he interrupted her. Postpone this afternoon's meeting by an hour. Claire thought she saw a glint in his eyes, but she simply nodded. That hour changed everything. Alexander took her to get their marriage license. They walked out of the courthouse, Claire still in a daze. Their photo on the license showed him with a faint smile, her looking bewildered. She couldn't reconcile this man with the stern CEO she knew from the boardroom. Her boss, her husband. The thought made her head spin. They arrived back at the office. To the meeting room, Alexander instructed, handing her a file. Yes, sir. Mid-meeting, her phone rang, interrupting the presenter. All eyes turned to her. Phones were supposed to be silenced during meetings, even the CEO's. Alexander frowned. Claire silenced the call. I'm sorry. Her phone continued to vibrate. She snuck a glance at Alexander, who seemed absorbed in the presentation. She checked her phone. The message stunned her. She stood up abruptly and rushed out, leaving a room full of confused faces. Continue, Alexander said coldly. In the hallway, Claire's hand trembled as she answered the call. Hello? A raspy voice replied. Claire, it's me. Ryan? She couldn't quite believe it. Claire, I'm back. Tears streamed down her face. Not tears of joy, but of despair. He was back. But she was married. Claire, don't cry. Where are you? I want to see you. The meeting room door opened. Alexander stood there, his gaze fixed on her like a hawk. Claire shivered under his intense stare. Ryan, I'm still at work. I'll call you later. She hung up quickly. Alexander had heard the name. Surprise flickered in his eyes, then his expression hardened. He walked towards her and thrust the file into her hand. Don't let it happen again. He brushed past her and walked away. Near the end of the workday, Alexander called her into his office. I have a dinner engagement tonight. These are the keys to the penthouse at Emerald Gardens. I've instructed Lucas to help you move. Claire stood motionless, like a statue. 2 hours ago, Ryan's return had thrown her into turmoil. Should she break up with Ryan and settle into her marriage with Alexander? Or divorce Alexander and return to Ryan? She scoffed at herself. How fickle she was. Ryan, her childhood sweetheart, the man who'd shared her youth, just because he'd disappeared, she was ready to move on. Yet, she couldn't deny the powerful pull she felt towards Alexander. Is something wrong? Alexander's gaze was sharp. Mr. Sterling, could I move in a little later? Claire, don't forget who you are now. He frowned. I know, but, could you give me some time to adjust? Adjust? He chuckled, walking around his desk and reaching for her face. You didn't need time to adjust when we were in bed together. Claire pouted defiantly. You wouldn't let me go. He ruffled her hair affectionately. You were too irresistible. Claire froze. His words, his touch. For a fleeting moment, he transformed into Ryan. She blinked, trying to dispel the confusing image. When she opened her eyes, it was Alexander again, the man who both intrigued and bewildered her. A ridiculous thought crossed her mind. Was she losing her mind? Why did she keep connecting these two men? They were so different, yet in her mind they blurred together so easily. She took a deep breath. I'll leave now. Go. He said softly. After work, a black car waited outside. Claire froze. Lucas, Alexander's driver, got out. Mrs. Sterling, please. He opened the back door. Claire stopped. If she went with him, she wouldn't be able to see Ryan. Lucas, I told Mr. Sterling I'd move later. And please, call me Claire at the office. She hurried away before he could respond. Lucas watched her hail a cab, then called Alexander. Mr. Sterling, she didn't come. I know. Alexander hung up, a cold smile playing on his lips. Someone was trying to steal his wife. He'd make sure they regretted it. Ryan had never been a match for him before, and he certainly wasn't now. Sir, I checked Ryan's information. Everything but the name matches your identity from a year ago. It seems Caleb has a powerful ally. Alexander sneered. Sir, whoever's behind this must have a connection to the Sterling family. Find out who it is. I want to know who pushed me overboard, who hid the fact that I survived. And now they're using Caleb to impersonate me and get close to Claire. What's their game? Sir, should we inform your parents about the marriage? Not yet. I'll tell them when the time is right. Yes, sir. When he was alone, Alexander looked at a photo on his phone, a tender expression softening his features. Silly girl. So easily fooled. Claire opened the door to the restaurant, her eyes fixed on the man inside. He turned, a gentle smile lighting up his face. He held out his arms. Claire, I'm back. Claire walked towards him mechanically. In the past, she would have rushed into his embrace. Now, she hesitated. Ryan gently pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, a triumphant glint in his eye. Ryan, your woman will be mine. And you can go back to being the Sterling heir. Claire felt a flicker of unease. This didn't feel like Ryan. Ryan always ruffled her hair. This man just held her. Ryan, she gently pushed him away. Yes? Your voice, it's different. He cupped her face. When I fell into the ocean, I swallowed a lot of seawater. He leaned in, kissing her cheek, her nose, then pausing just before her lips. Claire pulled away. Didn't you see a doctor? A flash of annoyance crossed his face, quickly masked. The doctor said it will heal gradually. They're not sure if it will ever be the same. Ryan, I'm hungry. Can we order? You and your food. He chuckled. Claire froze. Something felt wrong. The waiter brought their food. All her favorites. She picked at her plate. Ryan, have you heard anything about Caleb? No. Do you think he might be back too? Possibly. You were such good friends. I hope you find him soon. Yes. After dinner, Claire tried to leave, but Ryan held her close, nuzzling her neck. Claire, I missed you so much. The words carried a double meaning. Claire understood, but she needed to be sure. She pulled away slightly. Ryan, I just remembered, I have some unfinished work. I don't want to get yelled at by my boss tomorrow. Claire, quit your job. I'll take care of you. But you just got back. You don't have a job yet. We'll starve. I want you. His eyes were dark with desire. You're back now. One more day won't hurt. She hugged him, forcing a smile. I have to go. When she was gone, Ryan's smile vanished. His phone rang. He answered. Mr. Sterling. Claire unlocked the door to the penthouse with the key Alexander had given her. He sat on the sofa, working on his laptop, seemingly oblivious to her arrival. She went straight to the kitchen, searching through the cupboards and the refrigerator, a look of disappointment on her face when she didn't find what she was looking for. She joined him in the living room, sitting opposite him, watching him work. He ignored her. She took out her phone, a mischievous glint in her eyes. 30 minutes later, his phone rang. An unknown number. He ignored it. Mr. Sterling, aren't you going to answer? Claire asked sweetly. Alexander looked at her, sensing her playful mood. He smiled and answered the call. Hello, this is takeout. The security guard won't let me in. Could you come down and get your order? Give the phone to the guard. Alexander spoke briefly to the guard, then hung up. Claire, go open the door. Claire feigned surprise, then the doorbell rang. She opened the door, took the food from the delivery driver, and placed it on the coffee table. She opened the container. A pungent smell filled the air. Alexander stared at her, a mixture of amusement and exasperation in his voice. Claire. What? I'm feeding you stinky tofu, darling. Don't let the smell fool you. It's delicious. She held the container under his nose, her eyes wide and innocent. He recoiled, trying to stand, but she was too quick. She straddled him, shoving a piece of tofu into his mouth. Ugh, he pushed her away and fled to the bathroom. The sound of furious toothbrushing, followed by running water, filled the apartment. Claire disposed of the stinky tofu. Then she began searching the apartment, every nook and cranny, every closet and drawer. Every room except the bathroom. What are you looking for? Alexander emerged, wrapped in a towel, a smile playing on his lips. My husband, she replied, looking him up and down. Aren't I right here? His smile widened. My husband's name is Ryan. You're not him. She tilted her chin defiantly. Alexander walked towards her, ruffling her hair. Seems like someone's overworked. Forgotten her own husband's name. Claire glared at him, then suddenly lunged forward, biting his collarbone. She looked up at him, her eyes searching. Why did you lie to me? Lie about what? He raised an eyebrow. You're Ryan. You're not Alexander Sterling. She'd known it all along. This man knew her too well, understood her innermost thoughts. It could only be him. Who's Ryan? Does he look like me? Claire was at a loss. Ryan didn't look like him, but their voices. Sometimes they were so similar. Could she be wrong? The Ryan she'd met today couldn't be him. He hadn't called her a foodie. The real Ryan would have told her to eat properly. The foodie comment, that was Caleb's thing. Caleb, Ryan's best friend. Ryan hates stinky tofu, she said stubbornly. Alexander chuckled. Lots of people hate stinky tofu. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes. Alexander paused, gently wiping away her tears. Who's more important to you, Claire? Ryan or me? His question stunned her. She wanted him to be Ryan. She didn't want to think about the implications of sleeping with another man. That's why, during dinner with Ryan, she'd thought of Alexander. She needed confirmation. I don't know. I don't know, she whispered, shaking her head. He pulled her into his arms. After a long moment, he whispered something in her ear. Claire looked up at him, her eyes wide. You haven't betrayed anyone, Claire. You're still you, he kissed her. Later, in bed, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you to know." What if I'd slept with Caleb today?" He stiffened. He hadn't anticipated Caleb moving so fast. "It would have been my fault," she murmured. "How did you suspect him?" he asked. "He called me a foodie." "You never do that." He chuckled, pulling her close. "So, habits are hard to break. I even took voice lessons to disguise my voice, to hide my true identity from you. You went to a lot of trouble." She rolled her eyes. "So, how did you become Alexander Sterling?" "The CEO? I always was Alexander Sterling." "What?" He told her his story. He'd been 8, playing on the deck of a cruise ship during a family vacation, when he was pushed overboard. He'd screamed for help, but something pulled him under, like a giant tentacle. He'd lost consciousness before his parents reached him. He woke up in a strange place with no memory. He ended up in an orphanage, where he met Claire, then Caleb. They grew up together. The day of the accident, he'd been planning to propose to Claire. He knew she loved the ocean, so he and Caleb had rented a yacht to set up a romantic proposal on a small island. Caleb, consumed by jealousy, had pushed him overboard. Alexander, in a desperate attempt to save himself, had grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him down too. As they struggled in the water, memories flooded back. Caleb pulled out a knife, slashing Alexander's face. They fought until they both lost consciousness. Alexander woke up on a fishing boat. He borrowed a phone and called his family. His face, badly injured, required extensive reconstructive surgery. That's why he looked different now. Claire sat up in bed. "Caleb, how could he? You were brothers." Alexander sighed. "Brothers can become enemies, especially when they want the same thing." While they'd been together, Caleb had watched them from the shadows, his eyes filled with hatred. Love, for him, was possessive, not to be shared. Knowing the truth, Claire settled into her role as Mrs. Sterling, both wife and efficient secretary. One day, while Alexander was at a business dinner, Claire received a call. "Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Sterling's mother and sister are here." Alexander's mother and sister? Her mother-in-law and sister-in-law? Before she could process the information, she heard the click of high heels approaching. She hung up the phone and went to greet them. An elegantly dressed woman and a beautiful young woman approached her. Before Claire could speak, the younger woman rushed forward and hugged her. "Hi, sister-in-law. I'm Sophia." "Sophia? Don't scare your sister-in-law." Eleanor, Alexander's mother, pulled her exuberant daughter back. "Claire, dear, I hope she didn't frighten you." Eleanor's voice was warm and welcoming. "Not at all," Claire smiled. "Mom, Claire isn't that easily scared," Sophia protested. Eleanor studied Claire, remembering her husband's words. This woman, her son's childhood friend, clearly meant a great deal to him. Claire blushed under her scrutiny, unsure how to behave in front of her mother-in-law. "Mom, you're here. Why didn't you tell me?" Alexander's voice echoed from the elevator. "You're so busy, darling. I didn't want to bother you." Eleanor beamed at her son. "Exactly," Sophia chimed in. Alexander walked over and playfully knocked Sophia's head. "Ouch," she cried, hiding behind Claire. "Sister-in-law, protect me from my mean brother." Claire blushed again. "Ignore her," Alexander said, rolling his eyes. They went into his office. Normally, Claire would have made coffee, but Eleanor insisted she sit with her on the sofa. Sophia, clearly not suited for such delicate tasks, watched as Alexander, with a fond smile, prepared coffee for the 3 most important women in his life. 3 women, they say, make a crowd. The office buzzed with chatter and laughter. Alexander, seemingly content to be a spectator, returned to his work. "Alexander," Eleanor announced, "your wife, your sister, and your mother are all starving. He immediately put down his work and took them out to dinner. At the restaurant, they ran into Caleb, still wearing Ryan's face. Claire instinctively hid behind Alexander, who draped his jacket over her, shielding her face. Caleb glanced at them, then walked towards the elevator. "Isn't that your uncle's butler?" Eleanor asked suddenly. Alexander frowned. "Mom, I think you're mistaken. He wouldn't be working as a butler." "No, Mom's right. He was Uncle Charles's butler," Sophia corrected. "Are you sure?" Alexander looked at his sister. "Positive." "What is it, son?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing, Mom. Let's go." Halfway through dinner, Alexander received a call and excused himself. He didn't return. When they were finished, Claire started to pay the bill, but Eleanor stopped her. "Claire, dear, I'm sure Alexander had an emergency. He wouldn't leave us otherwise." "I know, Mom. You're a good girl." Of course, Claire wasn't allowed to pay. The bill was taken care of by Alexander's father, William. "Claire, Alexander had to leave on a business trip. Why don't you stay with us at the Sterling mansion while he's gone?" William suggested. "A business trip?" Claire was puzzled. He hadn't mentioned anything to her. She was his wife, his secretary. But she didn't question it further. During Alexander's absence, Claire stayed with her in-laws, comforted by their presence. She woke to a gentle caress on her cheek. She opened her eyes. Alexander's face was inches from hers. "Alexander?" "Yes." He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her. "I was so worried." She threw her arms around him. He held her tight. "We'll never be apart again." "Never," she whispered. Absence, it seemed, had made the heart grow fonder. The next morning, Claire woke early, watching him sleep. She poked his cheek playfully. He frowned in his sleep, then opened his mouth and gently bit her finger. "Ow. You're awake?" He opened his eyes, ruffling her hair. "I am now." "Where were you all month?" "Hunting ghosts." Claire stared at him, speechless. After overhearing his mother's comment at the restaurant, Alexander had connected Caleb to his Uncle Charles. Charles had a mistress. Alexander, wanting a swift resolution, had seduced the woman himself. The sterling heir was a far more valuable prize than the aging Charles. The woman had readily switched her allegiance, revealing information that shocked even Alexander. He'd dealt with Caleb swiftly and ruthlessly. Charles, implicated in the scheme, was now spending the rest of his life in prison. Years ago, their grandfather had favored Alexander's branch of the family, naming Alexander's father, William, as his heir. Charles, blaming his lack of a son, had grown jealous of Alexander. He'd pushed him overboard, knowing that William, after 2 children and a vasectomy, couldn't have any more. Charles, however, could still produce a male heir with another woman and claim the inheritance. He'd later discovered Alexander was alive and had recruited Caleb to carry out his plan. Eleanor and Sophia had met Caleb at Charles's house, where he'd casually introduced himself as the butler. Eleanor, finding it odd that Charles would hire such a young butler, had mentioned it to William, who'd brushed it off. But the comment had planted a seed of suspicion in Alexander's mind. He'd never suspected his uncle, remembering him as kind and gentle. He'd focused his suspicions on other relatives. After discussing it with his father, they'd decided to imprison Charles, sparing his life, and leaving his family's shares in the company untouched. "You're too kind," Claire said. "He's my father's only brother." He didn't want to cause his father more pain. William was both furious and heartbroken by his brother's betrayal. He knew that their father's favoritism had spoiled Charles, and he regretted not being a better older brother. Claire felt a sense of belonging she'd never known before. Surrounded by the warmth of the Sterling family and Alexander's love, she blossomed, becoming more confident and strong. 3 years later, amidst the joyous anticipation of the entire Sterling family, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. One day, Alexander took her to a cemetery. Claire followed him silently, puzzled. He stopped at a tombstone. Claire looked at the inscription and froze. Caleb Sterling. Caleb was my uncle's illegitimate son. His mother took him to the Sterling mansion, hoping for recognition. Aunt Beatrice, my uncle's wife, was the one who met them. You can imagine what happened. No woman in her position would tolerate such a threat to her family, especially in their world. Caleb agreed to my uncle's plan because he knew Charles was his father. A few months ago, Aunt Beatrice confessed everything to my father. A guilty conscience, perhaps. Uncle Charles, he lost his mind when he found out. Claire stared at the tombstone, a flicker of pity in her heart. Caleb, too, had carried a hidden pain. An hour later, they left the quiet cemetery. The shadows that had haunted them were gone, replaced by the memory of Caleb's once kind and gentle face. The end.